Welcome to the Bible class of Jews for Jesus. Tonight we're going to read Acts chapter 18, and we're going to learn about some important people, some less than important people in most people's estimation, but we're going to see God doing stuff. And I suppose at the end of the day, that's the greatest thing about this book. It's God doing stuff. And when you see God do stuff, what can you say? What should you say? Praise the Lord. That's it. Because God does stuff. And if He did it then, He'll do it now. If He did it then, I can have hope for tomorrow. He's the same God. And I like reading about what God did. Now, some things are really great, and some things in this case are going to be tough to read. It's not easy to see people rejected. It's not easy to see people beaten. But it's God who leads us into all things where we shout yippee and where we shout oi gewalt and where we experience pain and joys. It's God who leads us. So let's read Acts chapter 18. What we don't get in this 52 CE or AD 52 story is how long it takes between scenes. There are a lot of cities named, and I apologize to you listening online, but I'm going to show the folks here at the Bible study using this map, our new map of late. Can you see it? This is the Aegean Sea. It's pretty wide. Here's Ephesus, where we're going to land, and then here's Athens, where the story begins tonight. Here's this 80 kilometer stretch over to Corinth, which is another major city where it happens. By the way, this is where Troas is up here. So again, apologies to those listening online, but you should get a map and see where all these things are. This is Philippi, where the gospel began its Greek and really European journey. That was Acts 16. Then it came to Thessaloniki, down to Athens, over to Corinth. Here's Ephesus. Over here, let's see if I can do this, is Caesarea, and then Antioch. I mean, we got some massive travels on boats, massive travels on land. This is not, and then he took an airplane over to Athens. I mean, this was ships and horses on land and a lot of stuff and gear. This was a big trip just in one chapter. So Paul leaves Athens, where he had just had this successful ministry at Mars Hill, arguing with Stoics and Epicureans and all kinds of folks. And he went over to Corinth. Corinth, another major city, though it's not a university town like Athens is. It still was a commercial center. It was a pagan center. We know that from the book of the letter to the Corinthians. We know that from history. A lot of Greek historians wrote about Corinth. There was the temple to the goddess of love. And there were, some argue 1,000, some say 2,000 temple prostitutes who were assigned duty there. What a job. So it's a pretty significant town and pretty pagan town. The Jewish people are kicked out of Rome, we see. And this is recorded in several places, most notable in Claudius by Suetonius. The expulsion order was given, Suetonius writes, because of the Jews' continual tumults instigated by, they called it Chrestus. Instigated by Chrestus. That's the phrase that was used by this writer, this historian. And that probably is a misspelling of Yeshua. Chrestus, Christos, you get the idea. And the riots then were probably not instigated by Yeshua, but on the cause of Yeshua. And we've been seeing that as the Jewish people were arguing with Paul back over in Asia Minor and chasing him out of Philippi and various cities as he's been on this second missionary journey. So that's probably, it's fascinating when you think about it, how one guy's preaching and some people's responses caused all the Jews of Rome to be exiled. Because Pax Romana meant, hey, don't mess things up. We're all going to get along. It's going to be peace at all costs. And if there's a mob that's unruly, well, let's get rid of them. That's how easy it is to maintain the peace. Now, of note is Aquila, who's going to become central for the next little while, and we're even going to see him later in Paul's letters, who's going to marry Priscilla, or Prisca in other versions. So it's a way for God to get him out in a boat, isn't it? It's a way to get him out of Rome into another place. And so sometimes we look at the expulsion of Jews in 70, forming the Galut. Oh, isn't that terrible? And it is. And yet it got Jews to go out and be in the known world where we were supposed to be and doing the things we're supposed to be doing. I suppose when we look at the idea of exile in 1492, at the end of 100 years of the golden century, siglo de oro, in Spain, Jews were exiled and out of Portugal a few years later. And you look at that and say, how terrible, but it got Jews on the move and into places where we could be more effective or accomplish things. We often see exile, we often look at the pain of being rejected as, isn't that terrible? And I agree, it is, and how dare someone do that? All the while, God, who orchestrates our lives, may have a cause for us to be in another place. And if we're so very sedentary, He has to have us kicked out so that we can accomplish things for Him. In other words, there might be a good occasion, and certainly that's the way Luke will write here for us about Aquila. Kicked out, tradesman finds another tradesman, hooks up, and we're going to see these guys together really for the rest of their days, for the rest of Paul's days in various ways. He stayed with them, verse 3, and that really is indicative of what's going to happen to them for the long haul. They were tent makers by trade, but they stayed together by faith. They stayed together in the work. God does that. So don't worry when you get fired from a job. Don't worry when you get kicked out of your home. Don't worry when this happens or that. It's bad. I understand that. And yet, where is God leading me, and to whom is He leading me, and with whom is He going to cause me to be associated so that His name is glorified? Verse 4, he was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath, trying to persuade who? Jews and Greeks. It's just something we're not used to. But if you go over to Singapore and go to synagogue, you will find a lot of Gentiles in the same place as Jews. There are Gentiles who attend synagogue in Singapore. I'm sure in Hong Kong, where there are 3 synagogues, you might see the same. I've never been there. But it would make sense to me that there would be foreigners who want to associate with things Jewish or learn from Jewish people and such, and are there at synagogue. I know here in Sydney, there are Gentiles who attend synagogues. Regularly, I'm not sure, but there are certainly plenty who do. There was a fellow who stopped in the shop this week who used to attend synagogue and was even considering conversion, a Gentile, who then found a Jews for Jesus tract on the street, picked it up, and eventually came, we'll say, back to Yeshua. But it was one of those moments in his history to which he can point. He would have been there at the synagogue when Aquila is there reasoning and preaching. Verse 5, Silas, Timothy came down from Macedonia. Where were Silas and Timothy before? They were up north in Berea, and then they separated. And then they said, look, we'll get back together soon. How they'd figure that out, I'm not sure. We're not privy to that. But we do know that Silas and Timothy hooked back up with Paul. This is good. So the missionary bands, and we see a lot of motion in these chapters of the second missionary journey. People going hither and yon, and then they get back together. I don't know how they did that without email and Twitter. I don't know. Telephone, that must have been it. Long string. So they came down and they met together, and Paul began devoting himself completely to the Word. And in this case, we see what he's doing. What does devoting to the Word mean? Solemnly testifying to the Jews that Jesus is the Messiah. So when Luke records that he's given himself to the Word, that means to the preaching of the Word. It might mean that he's reading it. Might mean that he's studying it. That's it. I agree. I think if you are a preacher, you need to be doused in the Word. You need to be reading it, studying it, learning, inwardly marking it. These are realities that we have to do. And yet, the only way we read this text is he's devoting himself to the Word, testifying. when I read about medieval monks who gave themselves to the study or meditation on the Word, and they're not out testifying, I think they're missing something. And, flip side, when you read about people who are out witnessing, but are not devoting themselves to the reading of the Word, studying it, learning, inwardly marking, I think they're missing something. So, stop, you're both right. We can't miss it, however, that if you are committed to the Word, you will be testifying. Does that make sense? Verse 6 tells us again of a problem that Paul had with some of the Jewish leadership. It doesn't end here, but he barks at them. They resist and are blaspheming. Blasphemo is a Greek word, a combination of two words, marring or ruining the name. And he shook out his garments. What an odd phrase, isn't it? To shake the dust off your feet, to shake off the garments, to say, I'm dissociating with you. And yet, immediately after this, we see him still doing Jewish things. And we saw this earlier in, chapter 13, when he did the same dissociation. And the very next chapter, he goes into the synagogue and witnesses. So when you read these things about that synagogue and those Jews at that moment, please read it particularly, not universally. A particular is when God deals with Timothy or Achaia or New York City or 2009. He deals with a particular time, person, or place. He doesn't deal with all things of all times and all people like that. But he can. John 3:16, is that universal or particular? God so loved the world that he gave his only son. That's universal because that applies to all people. Timothy, take a little wine for your stomach's sake. Particular or universal? Particular. It was to Timothy at a particular time for his stomach, whatever was wrong with his stomach. Sounds like he had an upset tummy, had a bit of the bug, and that was his, Dr. Paul is writing him a script. So you got to be careful. When there's something here like this is particular. Your blood be on your own heads. I am clean. From now on I shall go to the Gentiles. Now Paul had been going to the Gentiles, right? And he will go back to synagogue again. So even this is not exclusive, but he's saying, at this point, for you people in this town, I'm done with you. Someone else might come along a year later, 5 years later, and offer it again to the Jewish people. But he's done at this point with those people. Does that make sense? He departed, went to the house of a certain man named Titius Justus. That's to signify, Titius was a common name. Titus, this is the particular one. It's a Gentile name. He's a worshiper of God. We know that phrase, don't we? What does that mean? Jew or Gentile? A Gentile, that's right. And his house was next to the synagogue. And Crispus is the leader of the synagogue. So we've got a Gentile who's going to be born again. We've got the leader of the shul, Crispus. They both believe in the Lord and all their house. Look at that. It's so great. Wait a minute. He left from there, and then the leader of the synagogue gets saved? He's done with Jews, but then the leader of the synagogue gets saved? You see what I mean? He's not done with Jews, but he's done with those Jews at that moment. However, God can save anybody at any time. And many of the Corinthians, when they heard, were believing and being baptized. That's so cool. That's such a great reward for a minister. Crispus, we're going to see him later in the Corinthian letter. He's going to even be named. The believing and being baptized. And you'll never see those phrases backwards. You'll never see baptized and then believing. You'll always see faith and baptism. Repent and be baptized. Believe in the Lord Yeshua and your house, and you'll be saved. And he arose and he was saved and he was baptized that very hour of the night. You always get repentance, faith, baptism. That's the order of things. And anytime you change one of those orders, you can't be sure you got what they got. God said in verse 9 to Paul, don't worry, sans souci. Don't be afraid any longer. What does that sound like he's correcting? Go on speaking and don't be silent. Verse 9. Why would he be afraid of the people? Yeah, in Thessaloniki he'd been chased. Berea he'd been chased. The pattern is set. Wherever he sets up, stoned him, left him for dead. A lot of troubles. So here's the mountain. He's now said, I'm not going to teach you people anymore. And so God says, don't worry, buddy. There's a lot of people. I'm with you. No one will attack you. Verse 10, I have many people in this city. You're not alone. That sounds just like God would have been talking to Elijah the prophet. Just like that. Elijah, look around. 7,000 other guys. They haven't bowed the knee to Baal. You're not alone. And I don't know if you've ever experienced it ministerially. You can feel very alone. If you go to a church and there are, you're at Hillsong and there's a few thousand people, you won't experience. But if you go to a little tiny chapel by the sea and there's 12 people in the sanctuary and none of them sits near each other, and 3 of them are gone on school holiday and there's only 8 of you, and even the pastor's away, you can feel kind of, wow, this is depressing. There's not a whole lot happening. Especially when you woke up that morning and you saw 3 Christian television shows, and each of them had more people and more noise and abundant songs and great slick preaching. And you're looking at the assistant elder in charge of finances who can't give a sermon, and you think, oh. And you think, there's not a lot of it. If you've been involved in situations where there's not a lot of it, if you said, I'll put my hand up, I'll go on the door knocking group as we go door to door in our community and try to share the faith in our little neighborhood. And you rock up to the congregation where you attend, and you and the pastor's wife are the only 2 who showed up that day. And you've got to cover 83 blocks. And there are 14 blocks of units inside each one, and 32 units in each block. You're thinking, there's not many of us. And you can feel really angry at those who should have been there to help. You can feel desperate. You can cry out to God, how come you've made it like this? You can be afraid because there's a whole lot of other folks. God says, verse 9, don't be afraid any longer because I've got many people in this city. They may not all be with you at this moment, but there are plenty, and you're not alone. And when you hear that, that is designed for comfort, reassurance, and strength for you to get back out there. Go on, don't nestle back in your room and say, oh, I'll wait till the crowds come. Just get on out and minister the word, be devoted to the word, and testify to Jews and Greeks of the love of God and the power of Yeshua. Verse 12, Gallio's proconsul of Achaia, and this is recorded in several Greek histories. The Jews with one accord rose up against Paul. That's not news. This is an instant replay. We've seen this before. And brought him before the judgment seat. This man persuades men to worship God contrary to the Torah. And Paul's about to defend himself, and Gallio says, I don't really care. You guys go argue over there. What do I care? I think that's a great line. What do you reckon Paul would have been about to say? Right before Paul's verse 14, about to open his mouth. What's he going to say? Okay, he might have argued, yes, I'm a Roman citizen, and I don't know who these people are, but I'm not contrary to the Roman law. He might have said that. What else? He might have said, law, Torah, I got that down long before these puppies were even born. He would have shared his own testimony. Good. Yeah, he does it 3 times in the book of Acts, so it wouldn't surprise me that he does it a 4th. Exactly. And all the while he's doing that, he's identifying with the Jewish people. Verse 18 tells us that he had his hair cut, for he was keeping a vow. That's not a Roman vow. That's a Nazirite vow. So he could have said, does this look like I'm trying to fit in with you Greeks? Torah, I'll show you Torah. Look at this hair. He could have done any number of those things. What else might he have said? He always seemed to take whatever platform they gave him and bring it back to Yeshua. So, indeed, if he were given the opportunity to address his citizenship, he would have said, well, you're right. I was born a Roman. I was born a Hebrew. Now my citizenship is in heaven. Because I want to tell you about the resurrection. Boom. He'll get to wherever you start. It's like reading a Jews for Jesus gospel tract. It doesn't matter if it starts with global financial crisis, apartheid, or TV sitcoms. They're all going to get to, and therefore Jesus is the Messiah, and he died for your sins. Every story we have ends the same. Therefore, repent, receive Yeshua, and I think we've learned well from the Apostle Paul. When they give you a platform at work, when they give you a platform in the neighborhood, take the platform, proclaim the gospel. So he's all ready to do it. Gallio said, if it were a matter of wrong or vicious crime, yeah, I guess I'd put up with you. But, these are words. These are names. This is like in-house argument. This is about your own law. It's not my business. Have a nice day. I'm unwilling. I don't really care. And he drove them away from the bema. That's the Greek word used here, bema. You know that in synagogue? That's the platform. And it's funny that the bema has become not a place of justice, but a place of activity in the synagogue. Then they all took hold of Sosthenes. I think that's interesting. And beat him in front of the judgment seat. And Gallio didn't even care about that. Who was Sosthenes? Keep your finger here and look at 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Paul, called as an apostle of Yeshua the Messiah by the will of God, and Sosthenes, our brother, to the church of God which is at Corinth, to those who have been sanctified in Yeshua, saints by calling with all of them. Sosthenes is now part of the missionary band. He's the leader of the synagogue who somehow goes from synagogue leader to missionary team member. Why do you suppose, now you know who he is, back up to chapter 18 of Acts, why do you suppose there's a big beating going on? 18:17. Was he already there? They took hold of Sosthenes, leader of the synagogue, and began beating him in front of the judgment seat. Who's doing the beating? It's a mob, that's for sure. You know, it sounds like synagogue people. It could be the Greeks. Plenty of Greeks around in Corinth. Yeah, they were ready for a riot. They were ready for a beating of Paul. So their energy level is up. Their peak.
What happened to Christus?
It looks like Sosthenes was supposed to be the legislator and get this thing done. Sosthenes, we've hired, you're the big boy. You go talk and get this thing done with Gallio. And Sosthenes goes up and argues the case, and Gallio interrupts and says, get out of here, I don't care. So the people now turn on the one who was the ringleader, Sosthenes. That's what it looks like to me. And they start beating up Sosthenes. And I can imagine the Apostle Paul looking with love and compassion and trying to save him, or some of the other boys who were with Paul. And that communicated to Sosthenes something pretty significant. Even if that doesn't happen, Sosthenes is thinking, wait a minute. You know, we're all angry at Paul. Why are we so mad at him? And why are they so mad at me? And why did I cop this? It's unclear, and so we can only guess. But something radical happens between this moment and 1 Corinthians chapter 1, which Paul writes after he leaves here. He writes back to Corinth after he's traveled away. Somehow Sosthenes, our brother. That's not a common name. This is the same Sosthenes. So Paul remained many days, took leave of the brothers, put out to sea for Syria, and took Priscilla and Aquila. You'd think he would have taken Sosthenes. And then he had his hair cut. He was keeping a vow. So he was done with that. We'll pick that up again in chapter 21. There'll be another vow later on. And they came to Ephesus. That's weeks later. They got back over to Asia Minor. And he left them there. Who's the them? Priscilla and Aquila. So what a journey already Priscilla and Aquila have had when they were in Rome, kicked out, joined the missionary mob, traveled for a while with them, and then got dropped off to take care of things at Ephesus. He himself entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. Wait a minute. Verse 19. He was done with the Jews. He shook his garments. He's not done with Jews. He's done with those Jews at that time. You see how the Bible testifies of itself? You got to be careful. I like that he entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. I wish we could do that today. I think we could go to, and we do it here at the bookstore, when Jews come in. We certainly reason with Jewish people, argue at times, bring down the Bible, have a discussion. It's good. We love doing that. And sometimes when we're on the street corners, we can do that. But this is, if you will, the normative way Jews study. He entered the synagogue and studied and reasoned with them. There was something about that was allowed in that day. And early Jews for Jesus in 1968, 73, that era, there was great conversation that happened. But soon after the institution of Jews for Jesus began, synagogue officials realized we were not just a fad, we were a threat. And we were not invited to those interesting conversation nights anymore. And we're still not invited. I haven't gotten my invitation to the Parliament of World Religions to be held in Melbourne next week. Maybe they don't have my email address. I should send it to them. Maybe I should go down there. What do you reckon? I want to go and hand out the tract called What the Hell? When they asked him to stay for a longer time, he did not consent. Verse 20. Wait a minute. Every other place where they've asked him to stay, he stayed. Now he says, no, I don't think so. If it's God's will, I will. And he left right there. Just boom. Got to go. See ya. Because he had a goal. He had somewhere he was headed. He had to get to Caesarea, greet the church, go to Antioch, get back to missionary headquarters. There was something about that we don't read here, but you could see purpose. You see that in Matthew chapter 10 when Yeshua sent out the disciples. And he said, when you see people, don't greet them on the way. That doesn't mean be rude. What it means is don't, because greeting isn't just, hey, how you doing? How you going? Yeah, fine. It wasn't that social greet. It was that 15-minute, 20, 30-minute, like, let's have a cuppa together. Don't do that. Keep on. You've got a purpose, and be driven like flint. Same thing here. He took leave of them and said, I really will get back to you if God wills, and he set sail from there. We know in the next chapter, and in the chapter after that, he does get back to Ephesus, and he's going to stay with them for a period, a decent period. So that does happen. But in this case, he's zooming, because he's got a thing he's got to get to. So don't look at Paul saying this as some kind of snooty, smart aleck. So he lands at Caesarea, goes up and greets the church. He doesn't go to the synagogue, does he? He doesn't go to reason. His purpose there is to build up the believers. And he went down to Antioch, even though that is north. Maybe this was written by an Australian. He went down to Antioch. Maybe that means he went up to Jerusalem and greeted the church. Some argue that he arrived at Caesarea because that was a port, and then went up to greet the church, that's in Jerusalem, and then went down to Antioch. I mean, it's half a mile up. And everybody calls it making aliyah, means going up. When you go up to Israel, doesn't matter from where you are, it's altitudinally up. In Psalm 121 to 136, they are the songs of ascent. Ascent, meaning in the going up. And they were sung by the Babylonian captives as they returned to Jerusalem. And so aliyah means to go up, and it literally meant physically. Oh, I know people make a big deal about it and make it spiritual. He landed to greeted the church, went down. Well, maybe he went up to Jerusalem. It doesn't say, and I think it should have said that. So I don't really agree with those commentators who think this going up and coming down has to do with Jerusalem, but I'll let them have it. It doesn't matter. I just think Luke would have recorded it because he does record things so clearly. He spent some time there in Antioch, departed, passed successfully through the Galatian region and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. By the way, that's the reverse of how he started on his second missionary journey, which was Phrygia, then Galatia. So it's a rewind. And now we get introduced to Apollos, who's going to become key again in the Corinthian letter and in chapter 19. He's an Alexandrian. That's a huge city, by the way. Alexandria in Egypt, second largest Roman city. Major, massive, big university town. It was good for Jews because that's where the Septuagint was written. I mean, it was a major city of the Jews. He's an eloquent man. Who else do you know in the Bible who's eloquent? Or who's not eloquent? Paul was not eloquent by his own admission. Moses was not eloquent by his own admission. But Apollos is, according to Luke, an eloquent man. And he came to Ephesus. He was mighty in the Scriptures. And we know that because at the verse 28, he's arguing with and refuting Jews in public, demonstrating by the Scriptures that Yeshua is the Messiah. I tell you, you've got to have that messianic prophecy stuff down. You've got to. That's what Paul's arguing. That's what Apollos is arguing. That's what Aquila is arguing. They come in and they say, look here in Genesis 3, that's what it says. Look here in Deuteronomy 18, that's what it says. Micah 5, Isaiah 53. You've got to know these things. And Daniel 9. You've got to be steeped in messianic prophecy. And if you're not, my goodness, there's plenty of sermons online, and there's plenty of good books to douse yourself in. Rothmel Friedland's What the Rabbis Know About the Messiah. Yeah. Arnold Fruchtenbaum's Messianic Christology, and Jesus Was a Jew. Moish Rosen's book, Yeshua. Third volume of Answering Jewish Objections by Michael Brown, all on Messianic prophecy. Any of those books are superb, and you have to know them if you're going to get into conversations like Apollos, Aquila, Paul, and us. That's the way it works. So Apollos, though, is unusual because he'd been instructed in the way of the Lord, but he didn't know who Yeshua was. What? He knew the way of the Lord, was fervent in spirit, verse 25, teaching accurately the things concerning Yeshua, being acquainted only with the baptism of John. So what's he teaching? He's teaching Torah. He's teaching baptism of John, which was a baptism of repentance, in anticipation of a coming Messiah. That's all he knew. Biblically, He knew a lot more, but experientially, that's all he knew. And he was faithful to it. And he began to speak out boldly in the synagogue. And he's not talking about things that they didn't believe. The Messiah is coming. There will be one. He'll be born in Bethlehem. There will be one. He will suffer. There will be, he's got messianic predictions. He just didn't know it was Yeshua. We're going to see that again in chapter 19 with some other disciples of Apollos. When Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside, explained to him the way of God more accurately, which just means more detail. They filled in the blanks. It wasn't he was wrong. He just was incomplete. He became a completed Jew, and he wanted to go across to Achaia. The brethren encouraged him, said, yeah, get on over there. And he's powerfully preaching and teaching. He took it on board. It was the next step. It made sense. He said yes. And those are the kinds of Jews we're always looking for, the Apollos Jews. The Jews who believed in what they've already heard, anticipating the coming of Messiah. Here's the final step. Thanks. Yes, I'll take them. And one by one, Jews in Sydney and in Melbourne and across the world are saying yes. And that's pretty exciting for me. Some who know a lot, some who don't know Bupkis, but there's a wide range of Jewish information and wide range of Jewish awareness. Smart people, not so smart, aware, not so aware. We're not playing on their ignorance because I'll refute anybody in public or not in public. It's not that we're aiming at the weak. We're aiming at everyone. Everyone. So no one should be left out. So we've seen some pretty exciting events tonight with Aquila getting kicked out of Rome but getting into the mix as God would have him to get him over to Ephesus. We've got Silas and Timothy who were out working, who came back and joined the mob. We've got Crispus and some Gentiles, Titius Justus. We've got Gallio, who's being used by God to bring Sosthenes to the Messiah. When you think about it, if Gallio had responded to the threats maybe by Sosthenes, then Paul would have copped it, fair enough, but Sosthenes might not have gotten saved. It's when Sosthenes saw the beating, maybe his own, maybe that's what triggered his own search. You just never know. So when somebody says, what a terrible thing that was, you wonder, maybe. We'll see. We'll see what else when the other shoe falls. And we see Priscilla and Aquila and Paul getting there and off and traveling and going quickly through some checklist that Luke records. You ever done that in your own journal? You write very deeply in your journal about some serious moment, and then you miss a day and you think, I better just write down where I went. And he just wrote, and he landed there, and he went up, and he did this, and the next day, then you've got more time. I don't see Luke's writing as even, and my own journal is not even. Then we see Apollos. Clever, eloquent, good man with a good heart who came to be a completed Jew because of the work of Priscilla and Aquila. Good job, God, getting Aquila over to meet a fellow who needed to hear it and explain it more clearly. Even as we saw Paul meeting up with Lydia in chapter 16, they both came over from Asia Minor and met up in Philippi. So we see these two, Apollos and Aquila, meeting up, having traveled a long way to meet up and then come to faith in Yeshua. It's just great. God will use us, send us wherever, across Sydney, across Australia, across the world, so we can meet somebody on an airplane, meet somebody in a market, meet somebody at a trade show, or outside the synagogue. You never know. That's Acts chapter 18.
You've been listening to the Bible class of Jews for Jesus in Australia. For more information, contact us at Jews for Jesus, Post Office Box 925, Sydney, Australia, 2001. God bless you.